Unaware of the black woman's ownership, Camille Johnson stepped through the Bistro Nouveau door. A prejudiced waiter sees her and provides horrible service on purpose. What he does not know is that the restaurant was alive with the quiet hum of conversation, the clinking of wine glasses, and the gentle music playing in the background. The low illumination gave the flooring of polished marble delicate resonance. Location, an intimate premium setting. One that Camille had always liked tonight. However, she couldn't avoid the faint worry that crept in her stomach. She had come earlier than Matthew, her husband, who was finishing off. He encouraged she go ahead and order without him, but now sat alone at a corner table. She wasn't sure if it had been the greatest idea. She looked about at the well-dressed patrons spread over the town. She changed her chair. A waiter showed up at her side. He was tall, blonde, and wore the black and white restaurants. Their laughing and banter blended well with the soothing jazz playing from the speakers. Ethan barely made eye contact. "You ready to order?" Ethan inquired, his tone. His name tag read Ethan. He did not grin or welcome her enthusiastically like the waitstaff at Bistro Nouveau typically did. Flat Camille blinked, a little surprised by his abruptness. She looked at the vacant table in front of her. "Could I just get some water for now?" Ethan jotted something down. His face remained unclear. Sure, he turned and left without saying. Camille observed him as he hurried quickly to another table across the floor. The couple sat there, a middle-aged pair with fancy clothing and brilliant grins were welcomed with a. Ethan spoke with them for a bit before moving on to another table. His attitude very different from the one he had just showed her. Camille shook her head slightly, attempting. Warm chuckle and a quick refreshment of their wine glasses, Ethan. She sat there waiting for her water, her discomfort deepening. Minutes passed as she brushed off the sensation that something was odd. Maybe he was simply having a terrible day, but as she watched Ethan make his rounds too. Other tables constantly pausing to check on the diners, displaying smiles and courteous conversation. Nevertheless, he hadn't returned to her table once she had visited here hundreds of times with Matthew, and the service was always perfect, but today it seemed different. She tried not to overthink it. Her phone buzzed with a message from Matthew, running a bit late. "Babe order. Anything you want, be here shortly, Camille." Wrote a brief response and set her phone down, looking up to see Ethan ministering to a large group near the window. Her glass of water still had come. She crossed her arms. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she watched him. He chuckled once more. 5 more minutes passed and still no water. Camille squirmed in her seat, her previous disquiet gradually turning into irritation. Everything else the people pouring wine and presenting meals in front of her had glanced at wasn't right. She looked around the restaurant again, observing the easy flow of service for everyone else except her. A knot of irritation developed in her chest. She called down another server, going by a young, beautiful lady named. "I've been waiting for some water for some time now. Could you kindly get me a glass?" Sarah had appeared pleasant whenever she had served them. Camille replied, her voice calm but strong. Blinking in astonishment, her countenance suddenly contrite. "Ma'am, I'm very sorry." She rushed off toward the bar. Camille waited, felt the weight of other patron eyes, momentarily glanced her way before returning to their own talks. The knot of tension tightened. It was not just the water. It was something else she had seen too often before, yet she put the idea aside, waiting for the service she knew she earned when Sarah returned with her water camera, thanks. Pretending she didn't exist, her silently seeing Ethan glide between tables all the while, felt the cold water sensation, the ice clink against the glass, but the flavor did nothing to chill her rising frustration. Whatever was going on tonight, it was more than just a bad day for a server. Camille took another drink of water, her eyes locked on Ethan as he moved about the room with an ease and grace not afforded to. Her grin was always kind and inviting, except in regards to her. She floated from table to table, pouring wine, refilling glasses, and engaged in light chat with the other guests. Though he paid close care to every table save hers, the longer she observed, the more her previous discomfort confirmed into something deeper. This wasn't simply about the poor service or lack of attention, it seemed planned. Her fingers delicately brushed the glass's edge as she considered her next action. Should she say anything? Was she overreacting? She had been in enough circumstances like this to recognize the familiar uncertainty creeping in Camille had. How to choose her fights. Today, the obvious disparity in treatment gwed at her 20 more minutes passed, and still Ethan hadn't returned to take her order. The restaurant was growing crowded, but it didn't justify the fact that he had. Ethan was there taking their orders with the same charm and enthusiasm he had showed everyone but her. Camille straightened in her chair and lifted her. He totally ignored her table at an adjacent table. Ethan's gaze fluttered past her. She turned her back and proceeded for the kitchen. Camille's lips squeezed a tight line. Her tolerance was running thin. She looked at. Her hunger grumbled a reminder that she had yet to even order much alone eat. Camille took a deep breath and determined to wave Ethan down the next time he asked her how much longer Matthew would be. Her stomach groaned. Gently and ignored. As soon as he came back from the kitchen, she lifted her hand once again. This time there was no way he could miss her. "Excuse me," she yelled out, her voice louder than before. Ethan halted, turning. Camille felt she could be overanalyzing the whole matter. Maybe he simply hadn't seen her before, but the look in his eyes as he reached her, she was blank. Made her second think that hope. "What could I get you?" he said bluntly. No hint of the joy or warmth he had offered every other table. Camille blinked, her displeasure simmering just under the surface. "I would like to put my order." Ethan shrugged gently. "We have been busy." Camille's eyebrows raised rapidly from annoyance to astonishment. She glanced around the restaurant once again, seeing how. She kept her tone measured, not wanting to push things too fast. Ethan went between the other tables, never missing a beat. Busy, certainly, but not too busy for everyone else. Ethan moved on his feet, his brows narrowing slightly. "Maybe you're just being sensitive. The other tables are perfect. I have been waiting here for about 30 minutes without even having my order taken." Camille tightened her hold on her glass, but she maintained her cool. She had heard variants of this argument before, allegations that her experiences were believed to be invalid. She wasn't going to let this slip. "Sensitive?" She repeated, her voice low but fierce. "I'm asking for the same service you're providing every other customer in here. I don't believe that's being sensitive." Ethan sighed as if she were wasting his time looking. "We are short-staffed and there is a lot going on. I will take your order, but if you are going to accuse me of anything," Camille interjected, her voice steady, "I am merely pointing out the... You know exactly what I'm talking about." Ethan's visage stiffened, his lips drawing into a thin line. He said nothing for, "You're treating me differently from everyone else in this restaurant." Moment, then got out his notebook. "What do you want to order?" He questioned, the harshness in his voice evident. Camille maintained her eyes, unwilling to back down. "I'll have the house special." Her tone matched Ethan. Camille watched him depart, her annoyance now combined with a great feeling of fury. She had seen this behavior before, this subtle, almost undetectable discriminate action that so many tried to pretend didn't exist. But today, it was there in front of her, unquestionably and annoying. She sat back in her chair, breathing slowly as she attempted to relax herself. Her fingers tapped on her phone, fighting the want to. Text Matthew. He would be here soon enough. But even as she attempted to concentrate on the dinner that was finally, hopefully, on its way, Camille cannot get rid of the sensation that things were just going to get worse. This was not over. Camille sat in quiet. Her annoyance simmered as the minutes passed. Ethan hadn't arrived since she placed her order. Though the restaurant hummed around her, she felt like she was in a bubble, ignored, neglected, and alone in a place where should have made her welcome. She looked at her watch. It had been over 45 minutes since Ethan had jotted down her order. Yet no meal, no updates, no sight of him, the faint clinking of. Tables continued to be showered with attention as waiters brought out dish after dish. A sensation of incredulity flooded over her. How could dishes and hushed conversations filled the air? Someone in a location like this, where service was expected to be flawless, got away with this type of conduct. Her patience had officially run out. She called down Sarah, the waitress, who had given her water earlier. "Sarah." Ma'am questioned, her voice laced with real worry. "Is everything okay?" Camille groaned, attempting to keep her voice calm despite the mounting pressure. She suddenly looked worried. "I ordered the house special over an hour now, but I still haven't gotten any food. Could you kindly check with the kitchen for me?" Sarah's eyes widened significantly. "I'm so sorry. That is absolutely not typical." Frustrated, Sarah hurried to the kitchen, leaving Camille's stew behind. She closed her mouth and watched as other tables got their food without any problems, all while she sat there feeling the weight of the... She was under pressure, but behind that, a deeper sensation began to bubble up, something akin to wrath. This wasn't just poor service. A few minutes later, Sarah reappeared, looking embarrassed and apathetic. I asked the kitchen. She started tensely gripping the tray she was carrying and said, "They never got your order." Camille's eyes grew in shock. "How is that possible?" "Ethan took my order nearly an hour ago." Sarah bit her lip, obviously uncomfortable with the scenario. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. It appears like he never put it in." Camille's pulse accelerated, her aggravation now rising into full-bodied rage. She gazed beyond. Camille rose up, her hands resting on the side of the table, and requested Sarah toward the kitchen doors where Ethan had vanished after receiving her command. "Please get Ethan to come over here." Her voice was calm, but with an edge sharp enough to pierce through the tension. Sarah nodded quickly and rushed out. Obviously anxious to avoid any conflict, Camille watched her leave, feeling the eyes of other guests momentarily flutter in her direction before going back to their meals. She recognized the stares. They were the type that occurred when something unpleasant was occurring, but none wanted to get involved. A minute later, Ethan appeared, gently approaching her. Table, his look as opaque as ever, he approached, with a small swagger, as if nothing were amiss at all. That was what irritated her the most, the nonchalance, the boldness of his manner. Gathering herself, she didn't want to erupt, not yet, but she was done being nice. Camille gazed at him for a long while, absolutely empty of any real worry. She didn't want to explode yet. Camille's brows widened. "A misunderstanding. I have been waiting here for over an hour. You accepted my order, and now I find out you never placed my order." And Ethan blinked. His face remained expressionless. "Even bothered to put it in? How is that a misunderstanding?" Ethan shrugged, and Camille felt a wave of rage at his indifferent gaze. "We're busy tonight, Faltz." Camille's temper boiled. "It wasn't a mistake. You've neglected me. From the time I came in, you've given every other table outstanding service, but you can't even be bothered to offer me the basic courtesy of taking my order, and now you're telling me it's just a mistake." Ethan's eyes darkened a flicker, his stance defensive. "If you're going to start accusing me of things, maybe you should just leave." Camille's breath caught her fury, now bubbling over. He folded his arms over his chest. "Blaming you? I'm pointing out precisely what's been happening all night. You have disregarded me, behaved like I don't exist while bending over sideways for everyone else. This is not about a mistake. This is about your believing you can get away with treating me like this," because Camille could feel the weight of the other diner eyes on her, but she didn't care. "I'm a black lady sitting alone in this diner," and the words lingered in the air between them, harsh and weighty. The other tables had gone silent. Ethan's cheeks flushed crimson and he moved uneasily. "I'm not going to stand here and allow you accuse me of being a racist." Going to let him shrug this off, not when it was so evident what was actually occurring. "I'm not going away," she replied firmly. "I'm paying to be here just like everyone else." With barely controlled anger, "If you don't like the service, maybe you should leave." Camille's fists clenched at her sides, her heart pounding. "Not kicking me, because you prefer not to be called out on your actions." Just as Ethan opened his lips to answer, the restaurant door swung open, and Camille's gaze turned toward the entrance. Matthew Stroh in his towering form, striking a dominating presence as. Ethan's breath stopped, and for the first time that night she felt comfort sweep over her. Ethan's face paled as he spotted Matthew arriving, and his stance altered quickly. He stood a little straighter, his eyes flicked between Camille and her husband, as if suddenly understanding exactly how poorly he had screwed. Matthew approached their table, his appearance serene, but his eyes fierce as they focused upon. Ethan inquired, his voice firm but compassionate, an obvious authority. Camille stayed quiet for a time, allowing Ethan squirm beneath Matthew's stare. She could already feel the anxiety seeping into his face. He didn't know Matthew was at least not yet your waiter here, Camille said slowly. Has been ignoring me all night, not put in my order, and is now trying to send me out because I called him out on his. Ashen now, his former swagger totally gone, he finally appeared to know who Matthew was. Matthew's eyes did not leave Ethan. Ethan opened his lips, but no words came out his mouth. Camille could virtually see. Ethan remained frozen in place, his face pale as he glanced at Matthew, the confidence and arrogant attitude he had shown previously. The gears spinning in his brain trying to save the situation was already too late. Camille leaned back in her chair, seeing the change in power play out right before her eyes. She didn't need to say anything more. Ethan had just understood. There was nowhere he could turn. Matthew's eyes stayed still. His eyes never left Ethan's face. He crossed his arms, his presence emanating calm authority, yet his tone was calm, measured. Matthew then said, softly but resonating throughout the suddenly silent part of the restaurant, "You have been neglecting my wife." Ethan fumbled his words, tripping over himself. No, sir, I didn't have." Every other diner had turned back to apparently wanting to keep out of the growing drama Matthew raised. He looked anxiously around the room as if looking for someone to save him. None was there. Eyebrow his cool head, a clear contrast to Ethan's mounting panic. "It definitely seems like you've been giving her a hard time." He kept disregarding her request, not delivering basic service, and now, from what I just heard, you're... Ethan's face became crimson red as I tried to send her out of my restaurant. He immediately shook his head. No, not knowing what I meant. I didn't know Matthew finished for him. Matthew cut him off, his voice harsher now. The edge of should matter who she is. Ethan gulped hard, plainly, attempting to recover some control over the situation. "I apologize, sir. I didn't understand." His annoyance seeping through. "Do you treat all of your clients this way, or only the ones you believe you could get away with insulting?" Camille sat mute, allowing Matthew handle the discussion. She could see the terror in Ethan's eyes. "I'm very sorry, sir. It wasn't like that." Suddenly his mind was racing as he sought to find a way out of the circumstances. He had taken decisions, and now he was going to pay the price. When things grew hectic, and Ethan's words spilled out frantic and unconvincing, Matthew's eyes narrowed busy. He said, his voice calm but forceful. "You had plenty of time to cater to everyone else. But what was the actual problem here?" Ethan's lips opened, but no words came out. He stood there struggling for a reply, knowing full well that whatever he said would just serve to delve further into the hole he had already excavated for himself. Camille spoke out, her voice calm but harsh. "It's not just about the service. You made a decision to ignore me, to treat me as less than every other customer here tonight, and when I called you out on it, you attempted to flip it around and make it seem like I was the issue." Ethan's eyes flicked toward her, but he immediately turned away, unable to hold her stare. His whole attitude had changed from arrogant AR. Matthew stated, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You're going to go home for the night. Deal with this." Matthew uncrossed his arms and stepped closer to Ethan, who obviously flinched here. "Tomorrow. But realize one thing. This type of conduct is unacceptable in my restaurant." Ethan nodded rapidly. His face became pale. "All right, sir," he whispered, hardly able to form the words. "Now go." Matthew instructed his tone, leaving no room for disagreement. Ethan turned quickly away toward the rear of the restaurant, going through the kitchen doors without a second glance. If the worst of it had gone slowly, the tension in the air persisted. The hubbub of the restaurant resumed as the customers who had been listening returned to their meals and chats, acting as if they hadn't just seen the whole scenario Matthew had seen. Turned back to Camille, his countenance softened. He grabbed the chair across from her and sat down, extending for her hand across the table. "Are you good?" Now the rage. "Your voice is kind now." From minutes before totally gone, Camille sighed, feeling the weight of the night lift off her shoulders. She grabbed his hand in response. "I'm okay," she whispered, though her voice was a bit unsteady. "I just couldn't believe how obvious he..." Matthew shook his head. Some individuals believe they can get away with such type of conduct. Others forget that the world is changing. "I wasn't sure if I should speak first," Camille acknowledged. Her voice is low, but I knew I couldn't let it slip. Matthew smiled, gently, admiration in his eyes. "You did the right thing, and I'm pleased you didn't let him push you about. No one should never ever have." Camille nodded, feeling a combination of relief and tiredness flood over her. The confrontation had depleted her more than she expected, but at the same time she felt stronger for standing up for. "Thank you for intervening," Camille replied, her voice quiet, and I wasn't sure how far he was going to take it. Ethan's behavior had been horrible, but in the end, he was the one who had to face the repercussions, not her. Matthew grabbed her hand once more, his eyes warm. "I will always have your back. You know that the tension that had enveloped the night gradually started to evaporate as they sat together, the world around them moving on as like nothing had occurred." Camille understood, however, that what had happened was significant, as it served as a reminder that, whether they realized or not, individuals who carried their biases with them, even in a setting as apparently polished and sophisticated as this restaurant. Camille and Matthew ate together, the previous occurrence still haunting in the back of their thoughts, but there was no further drama. The restaurant resumed its regular rhythm, indifferent to it or not. The importance of what had just occurred, Camille understood, and Matthew knew as well. The actual talk, the reckoning, was yet to come tomorrow. Ethan would once again be seen, and this. Time would pass without escape for him. The morning light softly streamed through the curtains in Matthew's office, creating long shadows across the room. Camille sat in one of the leather seats opposite Matthew's desk, her thoughts still replayed. The events of the evening before today were about establishing a standard, assuring that individuals like Ethan realized that their acts had repercussions, not just about seeking justice for herself. Matthew sat behind his desk. His tone was quiet but forceful. He turned over a few papers, sometimes looking up at Camille. "You sure you want to be here for this?" he questioned, though he already knew her response. "Definitely this. Isn't just about you or the restaurant. It's about the principle he has to hear from both of us." Matthew nodded. Understanding, he rose and moved to the window, gazing out over the street below. Waiting, Camille could feel the tension. Matthew turned, and taking a long breath, he yelled out. Ethan stumbled in, looking worlds apart from the cocky waiter he had been the night. The air thick and heavy like the calm before a storm. A knock heard at the door. "Morning." Matthew replied, his tone cold. Ethan gulped and nodded. Before he averted their gaze, Camille observed the little tremor in his palms, his customary arrogance replaced with apprehensive doubt. "Visibly nervous morning," Sir Matthew murmured. "Matthew didn't waste time with niceties we need to speak about last night," he said, his voice cool but bearing the weight of authority. "You're aware of why you're here, right, Ethan?" Nodded rapidly, his eyes darting between Camille and Matthew. "Yes, sir. I know good, because this isn't just about poor service. Last night's undesirable events in many ways than one. You have anything you want to say before we start?" Ethan fidgeted in his seat, staring at Camille, but immediately looked away again. "I'm sorry for what occurred, sir. His voice lacked conviction. Quietly, though, I didn't intend for it to come across like that. Matthew's eyes narrowed. Come off like what? Precisely, Ethan stuttered with his words, his voice weak. I was not personal. I was not meant to insult anybody. Just busy and things got away from me. I didn't realize she was my wife. Matthew concluded the statement. Now Ethan nodded fast, appearing even more uncomfortable. Yes, sir, if I had known. Camille finally spoke up, her voice stern. And cutting, if you knew I was his wife, you would have handled me differently. Is that what you're saying? Ethan froze, understanding too late what he had indicated. His eyes widened, and Matthew leaned forward, his hands clenched in front of him on the desk, stammered, "No, that's not what I meant." Uncertain how he could get out of the hole he had dug, Matthew leaned forward. It's not about whether or not you knew who she was. It's about how you treated her and the knowledge that you felt you could get away with it because you believed no one would find out. Ethan's cheeks flushed scarlet. I didn't mean stop, Matthew. Stopped, his voice hard and definitive. We are not here to hear your apologies. You insulted my wife, and by extension our restaurant. You did not merely overlook her order or make a mistake you believed it would be acceptable. Didn't matter, but it does. Ethan fall quiet, his head dropping low. Camille watched him, her fury simmering just below the surface. She had no empathy for him, not after the way he had treated her. But she wasn't done yet, I want to hear. Ethan, Camille replied, her voice calm. Why did you really behave the way you did last night? What made you think it was okay to disregard me, to treat me like I didn't deserve the same respect as everyone else? Ethan glanced at her. Face pale. I wasn't trying to insult you. Camille raised an eyebrow, didn't intend for it to appear. Ethan, you didn't even take my order. Ignored me for more than an hour while you. Attention to everyone else, you did not even replace my drink. How is that not intentional? Ethan's lips opened and closed. No words came out. He glanced to Matthew, expecting for a lifeline, but found none. Matthew stayed quiet, his look stern. We give you one opportunity to speak the truth, Camille stated. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat. Bobbing, tried to find his words. He paused, then eventually spoke his words, barely a whisper. I didn't believe you would create any issue. Camille's eyes narrowed. Difficulty since I'm black, and you assume no one would notice how you treated me. Ethan cringed at her words, the truth of the situation striking him hard. I didn't think it would be a big problem, he whispered, Matthew's hands clenched on the desk, his knuckles. Ethan's head sank, and for the first time he appeared to understand the whole weight of his actions. Turning white, that's the issue, Ethan, you didn't believe you could get away with. Not here in my restaurant, Matthew stated, sitting back in his chair. I want you to come back tomorrow for another meeting, and when you walk in, I expect excuses gone, and all that is left is a man facing the reality of his prejudice. This talk isn't finished. Ethan glanced up, his face a combination of astonishment and worry. Tomorrow. Yes, Matthew stated, his voice definitive. Go home. You should give what you have done serious thought. Think about your actions. Tomorrow we will determine your destiny here without more word. Ethan up and exited the room. Camille glanced to Matthew. Her brows narrowed in thinking. Why tomorrow? Not just fire him immediately? Matthew sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I want him stewing this for a night. Let it sink in, that he's not going out of here with a slap on the wrist. It'll make it more real. Furthermore, there's more I want to. Camille nodded slowly. You're giving him more opportunities than I would, but I believe you if he comes in here tomorrow and still doesn't understand it. He has to come to terms with what he did tomorrow. Matthew ended the sentence for her. He left the office considerably tenser than the day before, Camille could sense. The room looked heavier and more claustrophobic as they waited for. Ethan would either confront the reality of his acts, or he would be gone. There was a knock at the door. She looked at Matthew, who sat at his desk today. his face set in a stern grimace. Gentler this time, almost reluctant. Matthew straightened in his chair, his eyes hardening. "Come in," he said. Ethan entered slowly, his face strained and pale, the terror from the previous day now carved into his features, his shoulders drooping, and his normal arrogance had disappeared completely. He approached to the chair opposite from Matthew and sat down. Without asking, his eyes fixed on the floor, Matthew let the quiet linger for a second, allowing Ethan time to understand what. Camille watched him intently, her wrath still boiling under the surface, but she wanted to see whether Ethan would at last show any true understanding. Ethan Matthew started his last meeting. Ethan moved uneasily in his seat, his fingers twitching as he held his hands in his lap. His eyes snapped up to meet Matthew's, voice chilly but calm. "You had a night to consider what occurred." I stuttered, his voice weak. "And no, I made a terrible mistake last night. I wasn't thinking well last night, and I stopped Camille for a few moments before glancing down again." Interjected, her voice strong and cutting through his half-hearted apology. "This isn't about being careless or making a mistake. You purposefully treated me differently because you believed I wouldn't speak out. You thought you could get away with it. What I want to know is..." Ethan trembled at her comments, his cheeks flushed crimson, twistedly in his lap, and for a while it seemed as if he would provide another explanation. But then something changed in his countenance. His shoulders slumped and he... "I assumed you would just sit there and take it." Camille moved forward, her eyes narrowing. "And why did you think?" I let out a long, nervous breath, and I didn't believe anybody would care. Admonished gently. "Is what led you to believe I wouldn't say anything?" Ethan swallowed hard, the stillness in the room becoming heavier. With every second he paused, staring between Camille and Matthew, before eventually mumbling, "Because you're dark." The words lingered in the air, raw and exposed. For a time, no one spoke. Camille's pulse raced in her chest, and she felt a combination of wrath and vindication rising within her. He had. At last, Matthew's eyes darkened, and he murmured in a quiet, under-control voice, "So you assumed she wouldn't speak out because of her race, and she wouldn't deserve the same regard as the other diners?" Ethan nodded slowly, his face pale. "I didn't think it was that big of an issue at the time." He acknowledged, his voice unsteady. Camille said, "Incorrect. You imagined no one would hold you responsible, so you felt you could treat me like I didn't matter. You were mistaken." Ethan's eyes filled with guilt as he shuffled uncomfortably in his seat. I know it doesn't mean much now." But Camille leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as she examined him. "You're correct." Her voice is forceful. "It doesn't mean much. You knew precisely what you were doing." AP appreciating now. Matthew moved closer, his look hard and unreadable. "Do you realize why this cannot be forgiven?" Ethan nodded slowly, his face a mask of despair. "Yes, sir." Matthew gazed at him for a long time, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Ethan, you fired," said at last, his voice quiet but determined. "Pack up your belongings and don't return. People who treat others disrespectfully and with prejudice have no place in my restaurant. Your actions not only harm my marriage, but also so tarnish the standing of this institution." Ethan's face dropped, but he knew not to dispute. This was the end. Slowly, he got from the chair, slumped down, and nodded one more. "I know, sir," he whispered. "I'm extremely sorry." Matthew muttered silently. His eyes are harsh. "Nothing can heal this. Now leave without another comment." Ethan turned and exited the office, the door clicking shut behind him. The hush that followed was heavy, but this time Camille let out a slow finality instead of tension. Breath, her body loosening as the weight of the circumstances dropped off her shoulders. Ethan was gone, and Matthew reclined back in his chair, massaging his temples. The restaurant was better for it. I wanted to give him the opportunity. "To be honest," Camille stated, her voice quietly, However, I knew he wouldn't make it right. You did the right thing. Matthew nodded gently but firmly. I know, and this helps individuals like him not simply change overnight. Location. Our position must represent more than what we could reach across the desk with. We performed what we needed to do. He gripped her hand and gave a little grin. The office's ambiance changed. Felt lighter now, and for the first time in days, Camille felt closure because they had stood up for what was right. And as Ethan rose to leave the workplace prepared to greet the next day, he had to pay for his deeds. Camille turned back to face the entrance Ethan had left, knowing more fights like this more people enjoy. He would attempt to hide his preconceptions, but she also knew Matthew and she were ready to battle them. Together, side by side, they left the workplace prepared to face whatever was ahead the day after Ethan's dismissal. It was almost too quiet for a venue as busy as Bistro Novo. Camille and Matthew stood together in the emptiness. Restaurant before the lunch rush started the gentle hum of the kitchen crew getting ready for the day as background. Though a hint of the stress from the past still persisted, air seemed lighter today. Camille looked at Matthew as she asked him, walking gently across the dining room and her hand sliding into his, "Do you believe he's gone for good?" Voice kind yet inquisitive. Matthew added clearly. I made that clear. Camille nodded, knowing that. Not coming back. Ethan's chapter in the restaurant was essentially closed, but a residual notion lingered at the rear of her mind. One. She hadn't spoken yet. Yesterday night, I kept wondering if Ethan had such a problem with black people. Why did? Matthew lifted an eyebrow, a little grin pinching at the corner of his lips. He even works for you first. Questioned the same thing. It's interesting how many who like him believe they can hide behind their own profession and outfit. Twisted reasoning, but ultimately the truth always surfaces. Camille groaned with a combination of annoyance and incredulity. Flooding over her, it's ridiculous. He's working for a black guy who started this from the bottom up, but he has the arrogance to believe he can treat someone like me, like us, as if we don't belong. This is hypocritical. Unbelievably, Matthew shook his head, his gaze becoming serious once again. People like him explain their actions. They believe they can separate their hate behind a label or a payback, yet, at the end of the day, fear of losing power, of change, always rules. Camille leaned against one of the glossy tables her fingers were tracing, afraid of watching individuals she doesn't respect thrive. I still find it hard to fathom the nerve of someone like that, the edge of the silverware left out for the visitors for today. Matthew smiled gently. He won't be the target of scrutiny, because the black owner constructed his house believes he could look down on me. Final, sadly. But at least here we have established the benchmark for others like him would not survive on our planet. Camille felt a pride surged as she glanced around the restaurant. It was more than simply a business. It was a venue with meaning. Much more than each of them alone had created. Matthew had developed it from nothing, and together they had made it a success, one that straightened out everyone with decency and respect, regardless of their background. She murmured softly, feeling the weight of the last several days eventually lifts you. This location is not just a... Matthew nodded his lovely eyes at her. It always has been that they stood in quiet. For a time, allowing the gravity of those remarks to settle between them, the restaurant represented more than just a commercial endeavor or a source of income. It was a place where individuals of all origins, colors, and identities gathered, reflecting. As the personnel started to file in the planet they wished to visit, anybody who had respect for it didn't belong there. Matthew grabbed Camille's hand and guided her toward the rear so they would have some peace. Lunch was crowded. They proceeded past the kitchen where the cooks welcomed them with friendly grins just before the hectic day started. Camille closed her eyes for a moment as the light warmed her skin out into the little courtyard behind the building. Moment allowing the fresh air and the sunshine wash away the traces of the tension from the preceding few days. It felt nice too. "I'm glad what we did," she replied after a time, moving to stand in a spot they both belonged in. Matthew stood up for what was right, and we did it together. He always grinned, his hand gripping hers. Stood there in the peace of the courtyard side by side, knowing that while the outer world wasn't ideal, they had created a tiny area reflecting the principles they cherished, and the restaurant would continue to run more robust and more strong for what had transpired, and will keep fighting for the dignity going ahead. Dignity of everyone who passed those doors. No more silent discrimination, simply. Ethan is not a racist. Those who grasped the basic reality in Bistro Nouveau belonged everywhere.